Welcome back, everyone. This is the Dank History Show. I just like doing that.
I don't like that. I've not been into ASMR.
You don't like the triggers
I don't.
that help you
No, I'm turning it down.
relax.
I'm turning my headphones down. It's bothering me that much.
All right. Well, we are the Dank History Show. I am Bradley Cooper,
I'm Katie Cooper.
also known as the Valkyrie, but you were also known as Brad's wife last night on
Will you
Myths and Monsters.
stop? They were going on about that, and I sent him a text, and I'm like, you guys need to stop. You
Yeah.
need to stop.
Yeah,
Brad's wife is gone.
it's a dead meme.
It is a dead meme.
So
I
tonight,
don't think anybody here would have known that. I'm
anyone
just
that would have
kidding. You guys are
known
not that young.
would have known that meme.
Yes,
or would have
known that meme.
Well, I mean, Billy knew it.
Yeah, that's true.
So it just depends on when it came out and how old you were.
That's true. They would have been in high school if the youngest one's here.
Yeah, it depends on how soon you get on the meme train. Get a meme on.
No.
Anyway, so tonight we've got a very interesting topic. It's one that's not covered often, but it's pretty important. We're talking about probably one of the most important but most forgotten events in history, and that is the Great War, which is also known as World War I.
That's so weird that we don't know a lot about it.
I think it's because a lot of it's overshadowed by World War II, Electric Hitler Boogaloo.
Yeah, World War II seems to be like there's a clear bad guy, there's a clear good guy, good versus evil. Let's
Yeah.
get this. World War I is a little more complicated. Than
Yeah,
that.
it's a little more complicated. And World War II was the last time that the huge powers really clashed in that way. I mean, we've had lots of wars since then, but we haven't had anything that climatic, I guess is the right word for it.
And they were pretty close together. World War I and World War II within
Yes.
30 years of each other, weren't
yes, World War I ended in 1918 and World War II began in 1939, so that's 21 years.
they? Oh, wow.
So it was literally just a generation.
Was there anybody who fought in both?
Yes.
I would assume if it was only 21 years.
Yeah, especially there were lots of soldiers, especially generals that fought in both. And there were lots of people who were involved in both, as we'll find out. So, the name of this war is probably the most iconic one in history because it's such an ironic name, because it was called the Great War, but it was more destructive than almost any other conflict that came before it, which it was only topped by its sequel, Electric Hitler Boogaloo, as I like to call it.
Where did you hear that?
I made it up. I mean, I've heard of Boogaloo before, tied to electric.
Electric Hitler Boogaloo.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I think there was a guy T-posing out there. He just walked by and T-posed. That was great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I didn't see that. I'm
Yeah.
not facing the door. He is, though. He's in the host chair, and I'm kind of off to the side.
Yeah. I mean, you could, like, turn around this way and
That's
bring
true.
around
I'm staring
your
at the door now.
You could bring around your microphone over here.
I'm afraid I'm going to break it.
That's fine. I'm sure Matt can pay it with his grandson.
They're not his microphones. They belong to the university.
But this is the Captain Matt's microphones. So, this war, which began over the assassination of a prince in the Balkans, that's modern day like Serbia, Greece, and places like that, spiraled out of control to basically involve pretty much every nation on Earth. If you look at a map of all the nations that were involved, there were maybe like 4 or 5 that didn't fight in it. And this involved like these countries clashing on fronts ranging from Africa to Russia to the Middle East to Europe, basically everywhere you can imagine. So what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at how this all got started, what led to this great catastrophe. And we're also going to look at, a few specific battles. So this will be the first part of a series on World War I, and we'll probably do like 1 or 2 more. And this one in particular, we're going to look at the beginning as well as 2 specific battles near the beginning of the war. That was a real big mouthful.
That was a lot.
Yeah.
As well as World War I. It was a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot. It lasted for 4 years, for those who don't know, from 1914 to 1918.
So it wasn't a super long war, but it was very bloody.
Yes, very bloody. So we're going to need a lot of context to understand how this happened. So let's get right into it. So The situation in Europe was a very odd one on the eve of the assassination of this guy known as Archduke Ferdinand. Most people, at least, probably know the war began because some guy shot this guy named the Archduke. You might not know who that is, but you know that's the basic start. Well, Europe at that time looked very different than it looks like today. Central Europe, for example, was a mismatch of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which basically consisted of Hungary, Austria, and a whole host of Slavic nations. And then you had the German Empire, which had been created in 1871. Then you had the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and you also had a whole bunch of new states which had been created fairly recently, within the last, 10, 20, 50 years. And that's
so these were babies.
Yes, baby nations.
Baby nations that went to war.
Yes, and those are nations like Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, Italy, and the like. Yeah, Italy.
Italy's that young?
Yes, Italy was born about the 1870s as well.
Oh, I had no idea.
Yeah, about the same time as Germany.
I knew Germany was pretty young. I didn't realize Italy was young as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they had histories before that, but, the actual nation states themselves were pretty young.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So there was a lot of tension in this European continent at this point. For example, France's eastern tip, which was called Alsace-Lorraine, that's a mouthful.
Alsace-Lorraine.
Yes. It's basically, if you ever look at a map of France, if you ever see like that pointy end on the eastern side that's kind of jabbing into Germany, that's Alsace-Lorraine. That's the only way I know how to describe it.
Jabbing into Germany. Poor Germany.
It's like if I poked you in the side. That's kind of what it looks like.
Exactly.
So, but Germany had taken that over during the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, and that caused a lot of resentment in France. There were even, like, the schoolhouses at the time, the French would show maps that still had Alsace-Lorraine as being part of their country, and they tell their students, one day we're going to take it back, I tell you what. As old Francois Hank Hill. Yeah, Hank Hill, he was...
Yes, I'm just picturing Hank Hill with a beret right now.
Yeah, beret and a little mustache.
And he's just holding a baguette. Was that stereotyping enough?
What would be a Frenchest name for Bobby? I'm trying to think of one.
All right, hold on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
I don't know.
I'm trying to. What's just a random French male name? Francis, that boy ain't right. So the other big sort of giant was the Ottoman Empire. And this had used to consist of like Turkey, the Middle East, the Balkans, and all that. But it had been falling apart for a while now. Pretty much all of its lands in Europe had been reclaimed by the people who lived there. And now it basically was just Turkey and the Middle East. And if that isn't bad enough, tension had been rising for a long time now between all these powers. For example, France had formed an alliance with Russia against Germany as it was eager to get revenge against its rival at some point, And Britain had also formed a pact with those two countries, and that was called the Entente. And that basically served as a defensive alliance. Whereas Germany and Austria basically had an alliance as well. And so you can see where everything sort of tied together in this time period. And Austria-Hungary had been eyeing a lot of these new nations that sprung up in the Balkans hungrily, especially Serbia. And one reason for that is that there was a lot of tension within their own land because Austria-Hungary was a very diverse place. And by that I mean it was basically Austrians were the minority. They basically ran all these different groups like Poles, Croats, Czechs, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats. And all these groups wanted independence. They wanted their own nation. So there was a lot of tension there. And Russia itself had been struggling with a lot of revolutionary activity. And those were groups like peasants who were angry about the situation there. Because for those of you who don't know, Russia at that time was ruled by a czar, which was basically an emperor, and it was an absolute monarchy. It was a very almost medieval-like society. So there were lots of people who didn't like that. There were peasants who didn't like it. There were Democratic reformers. And there was one red boy, named Lenin, who...
Red boy?
Yeah, a bald red boy.
Red as in communist.
Yes, communist.
Not anything derogatory.
Yes, I just like the term red boys. And his group of communists, and he had been a communist for a long time, but his group was pretty small. But they had been trying to create a revolution in Russia for quite some time. And the Tsar at the time, whose name was Nicholas II, the only thing people might know this guy from popular culture if you ever heard the movie Anastasia, or just,
Yes.
all the legends about her. That's Anastasia's dad, Tsar Nicholas II. So this guy...
He's not in the movie, if I remember.
No, I don't think he is.
I think he's dead.
Yeah.
It's
Spoilers!
mostly about her,
Yeah, it's mostly about her.
which she may or may not have died. There's still a lot of debate about it.
Yeah, there's a lot of theories about that. But he, for the most part, kind of just flailed and wailed and didn't really know what to do about all this stuff. There were times when he would call for, like, a democratic parliament to show up, and then he'd change his mind and say, no, I'm not going to allow it. So he kind of made the situation worse because he was a pretty indecisive person. Now, during this time, the late 1800s, early 1900s, everyone expected that a global conflict would break out at some point. Now, global conflicts had broken out way before then. There had been places that were like world wars, like the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s had involved basically everyone. And there had been wars since then, but for about 100 years, there hadn't been anything huge. So people expected, all right, we're overdue for something big.
So was this like a time of peace, or was this more like a time of trepidation and they were like, well, there's something going to happen?
Kind of both. Like, it wasn't necessarily a time of peace because there was always some war going on, but they were always just smaller in scale.
Right.
It wasn't like the Napoleonic Wars where it was just all over Europe all the time. It would be like, oh, a place like Crimea, there's a war,
Gotcha.
Or like, off in Morocco. But people expected a war to happen. But they had a weird idea of what it would look like. And there was one guy in particular, and he was a Polish banker and pacifist, interestingly enough, named Jan Bloch. Jan Bloch. And he wrote a book in 1905 where he argued that the modern war would be a quick one.
And he was kind of right. It was only 4 years.
Yes, but when he said quick, he meant like a few months or a year.
He was partially right.
Yes. And he believed that because he thought there'd always be a quick, decisive winner who'd always just better utilize, the better technology. They'd be able to outmaneuver their opponent and they'd win quickly. And it's easy to see why he believed that, because a lot of the wars that have been fought recently, like a lot of the wars that created Germany, were like really quick. I mean, one of them lasted for 7 weeks. There was, the Franco-Prussian War was under a year. So a lot of people had this idea like, okay, if there's a war, it's going to be over real quickly. There'll be a decisive winner. Now, almost no one expected what was to come. Foreshadowing.
Dun, dun, dun. I love that you put 4 dots instead of 3 dots.
I like putting 4 dots.
It's what is that called? Ellipses?
Yeah, ellipses.
And then there's like a random space, and then there's another dot.
That was probably a mistake.
No, it's not a mistake. Whenever you put an ellipses in Word, it does the automatic 3 side by side, and then it'll do another one.
That's hilarious.
Oh, Word.
So,
wow, we just got really nerdy. I am so sorry.
Hey,
we
there's
just
nothing
talked
wrong
about
with
Microsoft Word.
there's nothing wrong with nerding out about Microsoft Word. Don't you remember Clippy?
I love Clippy.
I miss him.
And then the ones after it weren't that great, but there was a puppy. I forgot what his name was.
There was a puppy?
There was a puppy in like the
Was he named Fluffy?
I don't remember. He wasn't as cool as Clippy though.
No.
And there was the Dot. I like Dot. There were a few.
No one.
The Wizard.
Oh, the Wizard. That's right.
There was a Wizard. There was a Clippy.
No one will ever top Clippy.
No.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about what actually started the war, and that was the big assassination. So there was this guy, Archduke Ferdinand. He was basically the Prince of Austria-Hungary. So he chose to visit the city called Sarajevo, which is in modern-day Croatia, but it had a very large Serbian population. And he was there just, on an anniversary with his wife, Sophie. And his visit happened to fall on the anniversary of this battle, this medieval battle called the Battle of Kosovo. And this was a day of great Serbian pride. So a lot of Serbians in that area thought that this was kind of an insult, that this oppressor was visiting them during their biggest holiday. But for him, he probably was just like, oh, just want to go for a nice trip. So, on June 28th, him and his wife go on a big parade. It's a huge event. And there's this group of young men. Now, most of these young men probably were like 17 to 20. They were very young. And they were part of a group called Young Serbia, which is part of a larger group called the Black Hand. And they were
put Blackland.
Yeah, that was a autocorrect mistake. But Blackland, that's a cool name for something.
That sounds darker, honestly, than Black Hand. A hand is just a small part. An entire land of darkness.
That's true.
That'd be terrifying.
So they basically wanted to assassinate the Archduke, but when they were in the crowd, their first attempt didn't go off as planned. For example, some of them tried to fire their guns, but their guns, malfunctioned. Others would chicken out. One couldn't bring himself to shoot this guy in front of his wife. But they passed by one guy who finally lights a bomb and tosses it. But what happens is the bomb flies by the Archduke and lands in the crowd and kills about 19 people.
It's amazing, all these attempts, and they all failed. But then how it actually happened was like the world's worst change of events.
Yes. Yeah, that's what we were just about to get to.
It's kind of amazing that they had all these... It was almost like there was a sign that this shouldn't happen.
Yeah, it was a very weird how it actually happened.
That's a lot of attempts and nothing happened.
Yeah.
I mean, the people in the crowd dying, that's a bad idea, but...
Yeah, but the actual, spark itself.
The actual, target.
Yes.
It never happened.
And what was interesting
it happened, but...
Yes, but it took a while.
Spoilers. Sorry.
So, this guy who tossed the bomb, he jumps into the water because he wants to escape. But the water he jumps into is too shallow, so he breaks his leg.
Ow.
So being that young bravado, he's like, well, they're never going to take me alive. He tries to swallow a cyanide pill. But in kind of a dark way... In a funny, dark way, he and his friends had bought a batch of cyanide. They bought it on the cheap. So he ends up just sitting there vomiting instead and gets captured.
Oh, that's so... I mean, I feel bad. This guy's been dead for a very long time. But yeah. I feel bad laughing.
It's dark comedy.
He tries to get away. He breaks his leg. All right, I'm going to go and end my life. Nope, I can't do it. And he's just vomiting.
Yeah.
That poor guy. But, I mean, not poor guy because, he did something terrible. But you kind of almost feel sorry for him.
Yeah. And
that guy.
Yeah. Well, these were young guys, so a lot of
you said in your thing that their teenagers are 20. Was the oldest 20?
The oldest was 20.
How old would the youngest have been?
17, about 19. The guy who actually did it was people. 19. So these were young guys. And the guy who actually did it, Gavril Princip, when he saw it had failed, and he was 19 years old, he gets upset, so he just sulks off and decides, well, I'll just go to have lunch. So he gets have himself a beer and a sandwich at this random cafe.
As you do after a failed assassination attempt.
Yes, as we all should do.
Bradley!
Not that I'm encouraging anyone to do assassination attempts. But, so... The Archduke, he made a plan. He was going to visit the hospital to see the wounded from that bomb that had been tossed. So they go back out in their car, but they don't really tell their driver where they're going. So he ends up getting lost, the driver, and he can't read any of the maps because, they're all in Serbian. So they get lost, and then they make a wrong turn onto that cafe where this guy is staying, and then right there the car stalls out as the driver is trying to back up. And this is right in front of this guy, Gavrilo, as he's having his snack. And he just looks over and sees them there.
Basically, it's almost fate.
As
sad as it is.
Yeah, and it gets... The more we read about World War I and how it began, the more it sounds like fate. It's really creepy.
It almost sounds like it was destined to begin.
Yeah, it's unsettling, the stuff that happens.
Ooh. I'm uncomfortable.
So we all know what happens after that. He pulls out his pistol and shoots, and both the Archduke and his wife died. Now, This caused a huge outrage in Austria-Hungary, as it would in any country if, a big leader got assassinated. So the entire country was furious about this, and many people believe that the nation of Serbia itself was responsible. Now, that's probably unlikely because this group of guys, they were part of an extremist group that was infiltrating a portion of Croatia that had a strong Serbian population, but the chances of Serbia, the nation, being involved are pretty slim. But they decide they want to go to war with Serbia. So they contact Kaiser Wilhelm, who runs Germany, and they say, okay, we need your support to do this, because we're really worried about Serbia's ally, Russia, because Russia's a pretty big country with a lot of troops, and it's pretty strong. So what Kaiser Wilhelm does is he just gives Austria-Hungary a blank check. He said, whatever you do, we'll support it. And the reason why he does this is he really thinks Austria is just going to be able to run over Serbia within a week, and they'll be able to take care of them before Russia can even intervene. And as soon as he signs this, he goes off on vacation for 3 weeks. So no one can contact him at all for 3 weeks. That's going to be...
That's such a bad idea.
Yeah. He didn't...
How important was this vacation?
I guess
Where did he go? Did he go to the Bahamas?
He went off
Was this something he had planned for months? And his wife was like, no, you are not missing out for war. We are going to the Bahamas.
I think he literally gave his agreement. Then like, all right, I'm going off on vacation. And it was off to some island where no one could contact him as well.
I bet they had this plan for years.
They probably did.
You know how hard it is to get those cheap tickets back.
Yeah, it's really tough. I mean, who cares? No one expected that this little thing would spark into a huge conflict. So after this happens, an Austrian and Russian ambassador meet in Serbia, and the Russian ambassador was one that was actually stationed in Serbia, and they're discussing what to do about this. And they start to come to agreement, and they get some papers down, but right when it's time to sign, and they're just sitting around chatting, the Russian ambassador has a heart attack and drops dead right there.
Are you serious?
Yes, I am serious.
Are you serious?
Yes.
That's ridiculous. I mean, I feel bad for the poor guy.
Yeah.
Are we sure it was a heart attack?
We know.
Are we sure it wasn't something disguised as a heart attack?
See, the Russians themselves believe the guy was poisoned, but we don't have any evidence that happened.
There is no way. That's such a... Oh. Again, it's sounding like it's more and more like fate.
Yeah, and because Russia can't get another ambassador there at the time, so, no one knows what's happening. And then in Austria, back home, Archduke Ferdinand, the guy who was killed, he was really more for peace. Like, he didn't want any, wars. But because he was dead, Austria-Hungary was like, well, now, look what they did to him. So now we got to go to war.
Did he have anybody who'd be like, no, seriously, he wanted this?
He probably did, but because they shot him, they were like, who cares,
Well, that's frustrating.
So what they do is they draft an ultimatum to Serbia, and they send it to them, and they say, reply by this date, July 23rd. And what this ultimatum says...
Wait, hold on. June 28th was when he was shot. That was less than a month.
Yeah, the war started a month later, but
Wow.
There was a month between where there was a whole bunch of stuff happening. And what this ultimatum says is that Austrian police should be allowed to investigate this event on Serbian soil.
But they can't do anything, just investigate.
No, but this is made in a way that they know Serbia will reject it and they'll go to war. Because no country would agree to let another country's police come and investigate. That's basically almost like giving up your independence.
I can see their point.
Yeah. So at this point, the crisis starts to become much worse. Russia starts to partially mobilize its troops. France even says, all right, we support Serbia. And another weird turn of events, Russia never learns about Austria's true intentions because Austria didn't plan to actually fully annex, and by annex I mean take over the entire country. They just wanted, go to war, basically humiliate them, and that was that. But Russia never...
Humiliate them by going to war?
Yes, people would do that all the time in this era. A lot of wars were just done to, flex.
That's It's sad when you think about all the people who die.
Yes, it is really sad, but that's how conflicts go. They're not good. They're horrendous. So, but what's really kind of another odd coincidence is that as Russia is speaking with Germany about all this, the Austrians had never told the Germans, who were their allies, that they didn't plan to annex. So a Russian diplomat just says, well, if they plan to annex Serbia, then it's war. And the Germans don't know anything about that, so it's like, oh, whatever. So lack of communication causes more problems.
This is why you need to communicate. We get into a lot of fights when we don't talk to each other.
Yes, we do. And another weird thing about it is that Serbia itself was ready to give in to all demands, including the police one, because they didn't want a war, until they heard that Russia was mobilizing. And then they're like, all right, we can fight them off. So we're going to agree to all of your demands except this last one. And then, as all this was going on, there was this Austrian diplomat whose name was Leopold. And he had been under pressure from Germany to declare war. But the Austrian military, under this guy named Konrad von Hotzendorf, that's a mouthful, he told them the Austrian army wasn't ready yet at all. It was going to take weeks before they could get everyone together. So this guy, who's a real genius, decides, well, okay, here's what we'll do. If we just declare war now before we're ready, maybe the Serbs will give up, and we won't even have to fight at all, even though we're not ready. Yeah,
That's not very bright.
No.
Yeah, that's just dumb. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. That's ridiculous. That's like saying, oh, I don't know.
Yeah, it's like when you've got a deadline and you'll just say, I'll get it done by tomorrow, even though you haven't started on it all.
And
Yeah.
it's like a 20-page paper.
Yeah. So, Tsar Nicholas and Wilhelm's back from his vacation by now.
I kind of like the name Wilhelm.
I do too.
And I appreciate how Nicholas is spelled with a K.
Yeah, I do too. So they start sending telegrams back and forth to each other, and they were cousins. Most of the royals in Europe were cousins because of old Granny Victoria.
No, it's her fault. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, she was the one who married off
Gotcha.
everyone and got everyone related.
Okay. So the royal blood really was the royal blood.
Yes, and they've been
Everywhere in Europe.
Yes. So when they send these telegrams, they actually sign their names as Nicky and Willie because, they're trying to appeal to each other as, schoolboys because they knew each other when they were very young.
Wait, so do they actually know each other?
Yes, they were family and they knew each other quite well.
Okay.
A lot of them would spend time together, they go to a palace in England and they'd spend time together, or someone become a ward.
Gotcha.
You might be a ward of Victoria for a while and hang out with all your cousins.
Then there were a lot.
Yeah, so they knew each other pretty well. And after these telegrams, Nicholas backs off a little bit and he decides, all right, I'm going to call off mobilization. But all the Russian diplomats and leaders meet up with him and they say, what are you doing? You can't do this. And he gets upset and he goes and looks out the window for a while to think and try to clear his mind. And while he's doing this, an aide to the crown, and we don't know who this aide's name is, just comes up to him and said, Sire, we know how hard it is for you to make up your mind. Now, the aide probably didn't mean anything like this, but because he was so insecure about being indecisive and people calling him weak and indecisive, he decides just right there and then, he's like, all right, continue the mobilization. Let's get everyone out there. So
I can relate to this guy on a deep level.
Yeah.
I'm very indecisive.
And that's why a lot of times it's not good to make decisions based off insecurity, because
Life lesson, guys.
you will,
You will make the wrong decision every single time.
yes, you
Even
will.
if it seems like the right one at the time. Doing it out of insecurity. It's wrong.
Yeah, it's the wrong motive and it'll mess you up. And from there, everyone also starts to mobilize. And the reason why it happens that way is because everyone knew that the first army to get their people out on the field and get them on the railroads and get them into battle would win. So no one wants to be left behind. So everyone gathers up all their troops as fast as they possibly can. France does it, and they're determined not to lose again. And Britain is actually neutral for the first little bit. But they've told Germany very clearly, if you violate a certain nation's neutrality, we will declare war on you. And that nation is Belgium.
Okay, you're saying that everybody's mobilizing And then you're saying Britain is neutral.
Yes.
They're not mobilizing.
They-
They're not doing anything, right?
They are probably they're getting their people together, but they haven't declared war yet.
Okay, they're just prepping.
They're just prepping.
Just in case.
Just in case. So, as the war begins, Germany had a plan, and they had this plan for a while. And their idea was, if they got into a true front war where they had to fight France in the west and Russia on the east, they had this plan that they had to beat France very quickly, so it wouldn't have to get involved in this true front war. And for this plan, they used an older plan from a guy whose name was Alfred von Schlieffen. I love that name, Schlieffen.
Liefen.
And what this plan involved is Germany wouldn't attack through France directly. Instead, they'd go around through Belgium and Netherlands.
And they were okay with that.
The Belgium and Netherlands were definitely not okay with that.
Okay, I was about to say.
But Germany didn't really care. And so a guy named Moltke revised the plan so they would attack just through Belgium. But as I mentioned beforehand, Britain had said, if you violate Belgium neutrality, we will enter the war. But the Germans at that time didn't take the British seriously at all. In fact, they joked, they're like, if the British even bother to show up, we'll just send the police to arrest them. They suck. They're not going to do anything. Which was a very bad idea. And just to explain a little bit...
The British Army is no joke. Why are they making that statement?
I think they were just really arrogant. Because they
Clearly.
thought, we have the best army in the world. The British are nothing. Who cares?
I mean, if they think they can go through two nations without anybody bothering them.
Yes. And their idea is that they would basically tie down the French by attacking them in the French-German border, and then they would come around from Belgium and Netherlands and outflank them, and then they would, take Paris and beat France within a few weeks. So, that is what they did, and...
They beat France in a few weeks?
No, sorry. But they did that plan.
And it did not work.
It did not work, and here's why. So the attack into Belgium, it really relied on time. They really needed to get through Belgium really within like a week or so for this to work. This needed to be incredibly fast. Otherwise, the French could relocate, regroup. Yep.
Okay. That's where I thought you were going.
So the attack into Belgium stalled very quickly. The Germans got delayed taking critical railway stations and towns. And also, as they advanced, the Belgium and the French, they sabotaged the railways, so the Germans couldn't use them. Because at this point, railroads had become absolutely critical, because railways allowed you to get from place to place quickly, obviously. And they were very important for wars. So, Germany continued to advance, but it was much slower than they wanted. And they were able to beat back the French at first. And they caused the French to retreat all the way back to the Marne River, which is about, perpendicular with Paris. But when they did all this, they moved so fast that they were really overstretched. Their supplies were way back, they weren't organized well. And the first German army, swung north instead of west, which left a gap between them and the second German army.
Oops.
And what the French did is they were under command of a guy named General Joffre. He was known as Papa Joffre. Not the Game of Thrones guy.
I was going to say, did he get that name from Joffrey? Or do we have any idea?
I don't know where he got that name from. But
Is he just as ridiculous?
He's ridiculous in a different sort of way.
He's not a whiny 12-year-old that just
No, he had a
fit.
very fluffy mustache, as many people
Now
did.
I'm picturing King Joffrey with a fluffy mustache.
Yes. So he took advantage
I don't like it, actually. I need to think of something else.
That's a hilarious mental picture.
Now it's Ron Swanson.
Yeah.
He's like a blonde Ron Swanson.
There were-
I do what I want.
There are lots of people who look like Ron Swanson in the World War I. So he took advantage of this and he attacked, and he was able to drive the Germans back. But the Battle of the Marne, this was one of the first big, huge battles of World War I, and this battle alone left 500,000 people dead. One battle.
One battle?
And within 2 days.
A 2-day battle left 500,000 people.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. And
What? Okay, who was involved?
it was just
France
France and Germany.
Just France and Germany?
Just France and Germany.
How did they get that many soldiers?
Well, by this point, each country, France had about a population about 36 million, and Germany had 61 million.
Okay.
So a lot more people were involved. And also at this battle, there weren't any trenches yet. So it was just people marching in a line and, into machine gun fire, basically.
So there was no man's land.
No,
it was
not by
everybody
this
just
point.
fighting each other.
Yes.
And at that point, was that the first major war with automatic weapons and?
It was the first one where they were used en masse like
Okay.
that. Like, there had been a machine gun since, like, the 1890s or so, but this was the first time they were used en masse.
Where everybody had access to them.
Yes.
Oh,
So the French,
I
were
can
able...
see why this was the bloodiest war.
Yes, and it gets bloodier. It gets a lot worse before it gets better. So the
I don't
French...
think wars get better.
No, they don't get better. They just sort of end.
Keep going.
Yeah. So the French were able to push back the Germans 20 miles, but the Germans were able to hold on to Belgium and northern France. And what happened after that is the two forces, along with Britain, because they were helping by this point, they began a march to the sea. And what they started to do is they started to build trenches all along the line, and they tried to outflank each other. And the reason that they were building trenches was because, the casualties had been so enormous in the open fields, they needed something to protect themselves.
Gotcha.
But these trench buildings, neither of them, spoiler alert, neither of them managed to outflank each other, and they just ended up with these two trenches facing each other, and stalemate set in. And now, on the Western Front, this stalemate set in as each side attempted to break through each other's, trenches with these basically mass infantry charges. Because what they would do is you might be, a regular guy and you're sitting down in the trenches. Someone would blow their whistle and that was the sign for you to go over the top. You climb up ladders and you journey into no man's land. But once you were there, you're under fire from everything. You're under fire from machine guns, artillery, the people on the other trenches. It's a big mess. And not only that, but before you get to the enemy's trenches, you have to deal with barbed wire. So you have to have someone to cut that barbed wire so you can move across. So it's pretty terrifying.
Oh my.
Now, on the Eastern Front, between Russia, Austria, and Germany, things were a little bit different, but they were still pretty crazy. Like, the Austrians, for example, got beaten very, very quickly. Now, they weren't kicked out of the war, but the Russians did beat on them a lot. And the Russians were able to surround this fortress called Przemysl. And the Austrians under Konrad von Hatzendorf, would keep on trying to relieve this fortress, this siege, but they just ended up wasting so much people. Like, they would just send army after army after army, and they would just accomplish nothing. And even during, the frozen winter, they tried to do it. And oddly enough, Austria-Hungary also failed to conquer Serbia as well during this time. Now, the Germans themselves did do a little bit better against Russia. They were able to, beat the Russians at the Battle of Tannenberg and stop them from invading their lands. But neither side really won during this time. And also during this time, the war gets a lot bigger. The Ottoman Empire enters the war, mainly thanks to this one guy named Pasha, who kind of wanted to restore them to their former strength. But just like everyone else, he just ends up getting them involved in pretty pointless offensives that get a lot of people killed and don't accomplish anything. So, with all this happening, especially with how badly the Ottomans did, the Allies, Britain and France, and Russia, they got an idea. They're like, okay, well, we're having trouble beating Germany. We're just kind of sitting still at the Western Front. But what if we take out Turkey? If we take out Turkey through an operation, then maybe, we can win the war that way. The soft underbelly of Europe, if you will.
That's not kind.
No. They called the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe. That was the common phrase.
That's rude.
Yeah, pretty rude. So, they came up with this plan.
Were they really that bad? I mean, not bad. Really that not powerful?
By this point, they had been in decline for a very long time, and a lot of their former countries under their control had revolted against them and basically kicked their butt. So
Poor Ottoman.
The Allies got this idea, and part of that was also due to some racial ideas because the Turks are Middle Eastern basically.
Well, that's rude.
So, there were two guys that came up with the plan to attack through a place called Gallipoli. Now, Gallipoli was basically, it was It was a shore within the Ottoman Empire in modern-day Turkey. It's like right around where Istanbul is. It's a little tail. And these two British commanders, one of them was named Lord Kitchener, he was Secretary of War, and another guy was a name most of you will recognize. It was a guy named Winston Churchill.
Oh, yes.
So at this point, he wasn't the Prime Minister, obviously. He was the First Lord of the Admiralty, which meant the Navy.
Oh, okay. I didn't know he had anything to do with the military.
Yes, he was involved.
Which is why he was so good during World War II. It makes sense now.
Yes, but this one in particular was, spoiler alert, a big disaster.
Never mind, sorry.
Yeah. So they thought the sea operation would work well. They could take this land and they could easily, take Istanbul, Constantinople it was called, and knock the Ottomans out of the war. So for this operation...
Why'd they change it? What did they say? Perhaps
they
they
liked
liked it.
better
I
that
feel like
way.
we made that joke last week or the week
We
before.
did. It was during, I think, our alternate history show.
Yes, it was.
Episode. So, excuse me. So they got together a group of British forces, and they also got together a lot of colonial forces. What I mean by colonial is the British colonies, people from the British colonies. And for this particular force, they got together a group of guys from Australia, New Zealand, and also from other, Maori natives. And they called these forces ANZAC, Australia and New Zealand. And they planned the operation for February 1915. It's really weird to think about how long ago this was, but also how short it was. I mean, my grandma was born in 1915, so...
It was 104 years ago?
Yep. It's
Your
weird.
grandmother would have been 104.
Yep. It's really weird to think about. But, so they thought it's going to be easy. They're just going to run away, and that's it. And they didn't have, by the way, they didn't have any of their plans other than that. They're like, we're going to arrive there, the Ottomans are going to run away, and we're going to win. They did not have any plans to get out. They didn't have any plans of what to do if it bogged down. No plans whatsoever.
That stresses me out.
As a planner.
As a planner, that stresses me out. Why would they...
Yep.
And who was in charge of this? Churchill?
Churchill and Lord Kitchener.
I guess he did learn his lesson.
Yeah, he did. He learned his lesson.
Oh, Churchill, why?
So the funny thing about this was that this wasn't even a surprise to the Ottomans because they had been bombing this place, with their ships for a while, so they knew they were coming. Even Greek newspapers were reporting about it, that there was going to be this invasion. So the Ottomans got really well entrenched, and their allies, the Germans, helped them prepare as well. And when the British first landed, they were just met with withering fire from machine guns. And although both them and the Anzacs were able to gain a beachhead, they found themselves looking uphill at these steep cliffs, with the Ottomans looking down on them with all this artillery. And neither the British nor the Anzacs had enough firepower to get them off the hill. So imagine just, you're down there in the sand and, your enemies are up there and the cliffs above you. And
awesome.
What's really interesting about Gallipoli is if you look at pictures of it, it's actually a really, really pretty place. So it also had sort of almost like a, what's the word for it? Like a tropical paradise. That's what it looks like.
Is it still pretty? I know war changes topographical.
Yes. It's not like other places like Verdun in France. If you looked at it, you couldn't even tell something like that would have happened.
Okay.
Lots of flowing grass, beautiful, the ocean, the sea, Mediterranean Sea, very pretty place. But when the war came there, obviously it got less pretty. So as the situation really continued to worsen because they were stuck there for months, including during the summer where the Mediterranean can get pretty hot, and it got extremely hot during the summer. And they also had to deal with the nearly constant flies just zooming in and out.
Ew.
Not just because, the heat, the dead bodies, it was a mess.
Of course it was.
Yeah. So, and the Ottomans were under good command, the guy named Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who would later found the country of Turkey. Now, what's interesting about this battle is that the Anzacs themselves, which the British believed were really kind of inferior because they were colonial troops, they actually did very well, and they distinguished themselves due to many brave actions. Now, this dragged on from about February to January of 1916, so it dragged on for a long time. And the guy in charge of the operation, a guy named Ian Hamilton, was actually dismissed in October, and they put this guy named General Charles Monroe over. And when he took a look at the situation, he thought, all right, this is untenable. We've been stuck here for months. We haven't done anything. They're just people dying for no reason. So he tells Lord Kitchener, who organizes, he's like, look, you have to come look at this. It's bad. And Kitchener's like, no, it isn't. We're doing quite well. But he decides to visit, and he's like, oh, 100,000 people have died, and we haven't done anything. Yeah, we should probably evacuate. So, the evacuation, they had to plan this very carefully, because it was evacuation by sea. So, the people would have to get on ships. But if the Ottomans caught them while they were getting on the ships, as they're baying their defensive positions, they would just run them over and kill all of them. So, they needed a careful plan. So, what they did is they would let their guns, their artillery, go silent for a while. And then when the Ottomans started to approach, they would fire back with rifles. So they got the Ottomans used to the idea of maybe they're not going to be firing all the time. Because during wars like this, usually the artillery was constant. That's why people got shell shock.
That would stress me out.
Yes, so it was pretty stressful. And during this silence, they would slowly evacuate the area, and they would leave behind booby traps to slow their advance. And surprisingly, the Ottomans actually didn't learn about these evacuations until after they had already succeeded. So while the campaign itself was a disaster, the evacuation actually worked really well. So good to the people who did that.
So 1 point.
Yeah. And imagine how stressful it would be if you were the last group that was still on the beach that was waiting to get picked up.
Ugh.
Just waiting because you know if they catch on that you're pretty much dead. So that was pretty stressful. So one of the very interesting things that I found about this particular battle is that despite them being enemies, the Ottomans and the Anzacs and the British, the Ottomans and Anzacs actually did find a way to sort of respect each other during this. For example, they would make these sort of, agreements to sort of cease fire for a little bit so they can go out and bury the dead. Or they would have little plans so they would know how to go out and get water, so that they're not firing at each other. They'd leave little flags next, we're going over here to get water. So...
That's so sweet, but also really sad.
Yes, and
it adds a human element to this war that you don't think about.
Yeah, and there are little moments like that during World War I. Have you ever heard about that movie? I think it's Joyeux Nouvelle.
Oh, is that the one about the Christmas?
Yes, in 1914 there was a Christmas truce on the Western Front for a while.
It's so sad.
It is.
When you think of all these big numbers, you tend to forget that there were people behind them.
Yes, there were people behind them, and a lot of them might have been as young as, 18. They just, fresh from home. They probably even never left their town, and they're just going off on what they believe is this big adventure. Because that's how they would sell it,
Right, it's a big adventure.
Big adventure, you're going to be heroic, you're going to be awesome, and then once you get there...
And it was nothing like that.
No. And, so even though there was still a lot of violence between these Ottomans and Anzac forces, they were able to develop kind of, a little bit of a camaraderie. And what's interesting about this is I actually found that there was a monument set up in Gallipoli at I don't know when exactly it was set up, probably around 1970, but it was a monument set up to the Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand troops. And on this monument, it claims to have words from Ataturk, who founded Turkey. Now, these words, I'm going to admit to the listeners, it's hotly contested who exactly said this, because there's not a whole lot of records of Ataturk saying this or not. And it might have just been written down there, just sort of, put good relations between Turkey and New Zealand. But regardless, I think the spirit of what is said in this monument is very important, and that's why I'm going to read it to you. Okay. So at this Anzac memorial, it has this quote about the Anzacs, and it says, "Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us, where they lie side by side in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now living in are lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives in this land, they have become our sons as well.
Ow. Ouch.
Yeah.
Ouch.
Because when we look at this war, and like any horrible event, it's very easy to get lost in, the huge numbers and, it seems like it's such a long time ago. We forget these were actual people, individuals who had
families
and hopes and dreams and stuff like that.
and their lives were cut short because they were young.
Yes, they were young. And that's sort of the great tragedy of this war, because this is really... Before then, people always had an idea of war being glorious. That's been throughout all of history, People thought, I'm going to go to war, I'm going to win glory. But what modern warfare does is that the killing is made so proficient and so mechanical that the way one guy described it is the first modern war, especially World War I, World War II, they are completely impersonal.
Yes.
Like...
Those 500,000 at the beginning and all the ones after.
Yeah.
They may have not even seen the people they shot because there was so much going on.
No. And this war, which we're going to talk a little bit more, in some ways it impacted our world more than World War II. Because of it, 4 empires died right off the bat. And also... the idea of empires or imperialism or colonialism, this war pretty much killed that, which is very interesting because we are still living in the aftermath of colonialism, right?
Right.
In a lot of these countries. So it's very interesting, and we're not going to, it's not, this series isn't all going to be sad stories. We're also going to talk about some interesting people as well that fought in it, like, Tolkien or I can't remember what her name was, that famous dancer, the Matahara?
Was that the spy?
Yes.
Okay. I don't remember her name, but I remember she was a spy.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about some very interesting people, and we're done a little bit early, but that's pretty much all I had for this episode, so...
Wow. So at this point, how many people have died?
By 1915, I'd say it's probably around 2 million by this point.
2 million, and there's 3 more years.
Yeah, I believe, military losses were, around, 9 to 11 million in total among all nations. And that's not including the civilian casualties.
I was about to say, did we have a lot of civilians?
Yeah, it was about 5 million on civilian. Oh. And that includes things like the Armenian genocide as well. So.
Oh, man.
So
compared World War I to World War II, World War II is longer.
Yes.
Death toll?
World War II was 65 million.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Ouch.
World War II put it to shame. And what's interesting about World War II is that World War II, people, especially in Britain and France, were very hesitant to, go to war with Germany and, deal with Hitler. And the reason for that was just because of how bad World War I was.
Oh, yeah.
Because,
you don't want to deal with that again.
No. And this was really the war that sort of defined that generation and sort of, it influenced the culture, it influenced the writing, it influenced how people looked at things, how people looked at the world. And it's a pretty intense one. One way I like to look at it is that this was the war when all the eggs that were sort of laid by all those little evils, like colonizing a nation here, like taking over a place here, like making alliances here, like, strategizing here. That's where all those eggs hatch at once, and then everyone in those countries sort of has to pay the price, if that makes sense. Huh. Like the leaders have to pay the price for what they've done.
It's still so sad to think about.
It is very sad to think about. But there's also a lot of very interesting things that get developed during World War I. Like, did you know that vegan sausages were developed during this time?
Are you serious?
Yes. And that was
is there a reason why?
Okay, so the reason for that is that India, of course, was part of the British Empire at this time. And a lot of the Indians were, they were vegetarians, or they didn't like, eating beef. So they developed vegetarian sausages as a way of sort of, here, you can have your sausages.
So the Indians created vegan sausages?
Yes.
I had no idea.
Yes. And also there was a lot of development in like medicine and like flying technology, for example.
Right. When we talked about the, what was that?
Red Baron.
The Red Baron and like our aviation episode.
Mm-hmm.
You talked a lot about World War One starting some of that.
Yeah, because planes before World War One were very like, they were like rickety. They almost looked like they were made of like popsicle sticks is the way I can describe it.
They really did.
Yeah, if you ever looked at the Wright plane, I can't remember what it's called. It's just like probably the Wright propeller. It's just, I don't see how that thing could fly.
It had like 2 layers, didn't it?
Yeah, it had 2 layers, and the propeller was in the back.
It didn't go very far or very high, so it makes sense.
No, it didn't. But so yeah, World War One, very interesting time. A lot of big things happened. A lot of big writers from that time got their start in World War One. Even like, Tolkien fought as part of the British Army, and that really informed the way he wrote about Mordor. Like, if you notice, like, in Return of the King, have you noticed how he describes Mordor?
Yeah, it's very dark and shadowy and bloody and ugh.
Yeah, and there's all these flames popping out at all
Yeah.
times, and all the trees are gone and stuff like that.
So it's very much World War One imagery.
Yes, very much World War One imagery. So this has been a very, I think, interesting start to this series. And next week, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the other battles and also the end of the war and what sort of came about as a result of that.
Are you talking like the direct end or like how it affects modern society?
Pretty much the
Or
direct both.
Okay.
Because one way people have described War One is it kind of ends almost with a whimper or a sigh of relief. Because unlike World War II, there isn't really a climactic moment that ends it.
Right.
It's sort of just one side just sort of gives up.
Well, that'll be interesting.
Yep.
It'll be sad, but it'll be interesting.
Yep. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll be back on next week, same time, same place. Once again, I'm Bradley Cooper.
I'm Katie Cooper. Did you want to plug your social media?
Yes, that's right. So you can follow us at History Dank on Twitter. That's with a capital H and a capital D. Oh, yeah, and I also want to mention one more thing. You might see some of the Dank History Force around IUS.
The Dank History Force.
That's been hidden around. So if